They told me in the quiet of a Cairo tent while sand hissed against the canvas that a man of destiny could not be broken by mortal means. I believed them. I believed the stars that guided my divisions, the sheen of my ivory-handled revolvers, the way history bent around my will at El Gueter and in the dash across France. I believed because belief is the general's first and final weapon. It turns doubt into fuel and the heart into a metronome keeping time for 1,000 marching boots. Now from this damned and silent German winter, I speak into a void that feels like judgment. The war is ending. Men speak of peace with the relieved sigh of clerks finishing a ledger. They ask me, the general, the instrument of wrath, to hang up my pistols and learn the grammar of peacetime. They do not understand my voice was forged in more than one life. I have heard it echoing in the shouts of legionaries, in the thunder of cavalry charges, in the whistle of cannonballs over Gettysburg fields. These memories are not recollections. They are layers of my soul, a stratified certainty that I am more than this single body, this single name, George Smith Patton. That certainty is both my sword and my shackle. Listen, the timbre I used to turn boys into killers. Courage is a science I have perfected, discipline a language I wrote the primer for. I learned to measure fear like an engineer measures stress on a bridge. Yet there exists another ledger, older than any doctrine. In it, the accounts never close. Faces return in different uniforms under different flags. The taste of victory, so sharp and sweet at the moment of triumph, invariably turns to ash in the mouth. I have seen the same red sunrise through the smoke of 100 fields, at the Musargan in the dust of Morocco, and in the mist of mornings that smelled of sweat and leather, long before this war, before any war I am supposed to remember. I have stood at the precipice of other men's mortality and stepped back, convinced the abyss was for them, not for me. It is a perilous thing to believe yourself immortal. That belief elevates you until you forget you have weight. It teaches you to scorn the small humanity of others, to see their fragility as weakness, and to demand obeisance from fate itself. In that arrogance, an appetite was born, not just for victory, but for the sacred mechanics of war itself. I learned to love the precise symphony of armored columns, the geometric beauty of deployment, the way an army under my command became a single, magnificent beast, its will an extension of my own. There was a music to it, terrible and pure, and in that music I became convinced the drumbeat of my destiny would never cease. Yet even gods of one's own making are not immune to doubt. In the still hours between the final reconnaissance report and the first gray smear of dawn, a colder voice whispers, "What if immortality is not triumph over death, but a sentence to witness? What if it is not an escape, but an endless repetition?" I have watched landscapes transmute into one another. The dunes of North Africa folding into the mud of the Lorraine, the frozen woods of the Ardennes echoing with the same silent menace as mountains I once crossed under a different banner. My name appears in dispatches and newspapers, but I have also found myself a stranger to the men who call me Old Blood and Guts. The title is an echo growing fainter with each passing quiet day, so I write this. Not a report for history, but a map of the interior campaigns I have fought alone. Here begins the ledger of a commander who believed himself impervious to the decay that claims ordinary men. I will trace the theaters of my obsession, the brutal glory I worshipped, and the deeper shadow that worshipped me in return. I will speak of the men who followed me to hell and the ghosts who followed me back. If you read this and hear only a soldier's bravado, you are deaf. If you hear the tremor beneath the drumbeat, then you may understand the true burden of a man who could not relinquish war, because he believed not even death would dare relieve him of command. The world after the Nazi surrender reeked of damp plaster, diesel, and rot. Europe was a corpse still twitching with nerve endings of resistance, and I, its self-appointed undertaker, roamed the ruins with my medals shining like false, tiny suns. The fields near Trier, the forests outside Bastogne, they were pocked with shell craters that filled with rainwater and memory in equal measure. My men joked. They smoked lucky strikes, they rebuilt bridges for the sake of rebuilding, they flirted with frailines. I could not join them. My eyes saw double, triple, a palimpsest of pain. Beneath every burnt-out panzer I glimpsed the bones of a Carthaginian war elephant. Under the rubble of a medieval church, I saw the stones of a temple to Mars I once ordered built. The land breathed when the wind stilled. It whispered in languages dead for millennia. I felt it first in Sicily, standing in a Greek amphitheater at Syracuse, the stone seats holding the phantom applause for tragedies far older than mine. I felt it again on the road to relief at Bastogne, a cold certainty that I had led a desperate relief column here before, through different snows, under a different eagle standard. One evening near the Saar, I stood alone in a graveyard of tanks. Their carcasses were still warm, steel ribs glowing dully where internal fires had licked them. I placed my palm on the blasted turret of a panther. The metal pulsed, humming with the residual fury of its dying crew. The scent of cordite and cooked iron became the scent of ozone and bronze. For one heartbeat, I was not a general in 1945, but a commander of chariots. The stars above were the same indifferent specks that had watched me die at Zama, that had guided me at Agincourt, that had shone on the Surgeon's Creek at the Battle of Fredericksburg. My heart did not race with fear, but with a dreadful, weary recognition. I have been here. I have killed here. I have died here. That is the curse. Not to forget, but to remember too much. To see the beauty of a tactical maneuver and the river of blood it requires as inseparable twin strands of the same rope. When dawn broke over the Moselle River, its light struck the water like a slashing blade. In that shimmer, I saw the reflection of all rivers I had ever crossed, the Rubicon deciding a republic's fate, the Rappahannock running red, the muddy trickles of the Argonne. The current carried away burnt paper from maps and the murmured oaths of soldiers who had saluted me across centuries. They recognized the essence beneath the uniform. They whispered the same word in every tongue: forward. Even in mandated rest, I found no peace. My aides slept in their tents, boys exhausted by a war they thought was over. I remained awake, tracing lines on maps of a Europe already conquered. The external map was complete. The internal one was a seething red web. My war had not ended. It had merely shifted terrain from continent to cranium. And then, in my command tent, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the brisk step of an aide, but a slow, measured tread of leather on packed earth. I turned, expecting to see Codman or someone with a midnight query. Instead, I saw the faint outline of a man in segmented Roman armor, a larica segmentata, the bronze dull but unmistakable. His face was hidden in the shadow of his helmet's brow. He did not speak. He only raised his gladius in a silent, perpendicular salute. In that moment, time collapsed. The conqueror of the Third Army acknowledged the conqueror of Gaul. Then he was gone, and the night air was just cold. I knew then I was being followed. Not by spies or assassins, but by the procession of my own incarnations. The landscape was hell not because of war, but because I could never, ever leave it. They called it a convalescence. To me, it was exile. The war machine was halting, and I was expected to become a civilian in uniform, a saber without a foe. Eisenhower smiled his diplomatic smile, spoke of military government, of diplomacy, of parades down Fifth Avenue. Beneath the polished words, the message was clear: you are obsolete. The thought was a gangrene in my spirit. I had lived my entire life within the holy rhythm of command, order, movement, conquest. The silence that followed victory was a vacuum screaming in my ears. My beloved tanks sat silent in depots, bleeding rust into the German rain. I walked among them like a bishop in a cathedral of fallen idols, whispering encouragement to machines that could no longer hear me. Peace, they said, but peace is the slowest, most insidious form of death for a warrior. So I began to test the boundaries of my supposed immortality. I drove my open-top Cadillac at suicidal speeds down rubble-strewn autobahns, my staff officers white-knuckled beside me. I stood with arrogant calm near unexploded ordnance. I would take my pistol from its holster, feel the cool weight of it, stare into the dark eye of the barrel, and feel the trigger against my finger like the heartbeat of a god I might still become. Each time, fate blinked first. Each time I survived unscathed, the conviction hardened. I was an eternal instrument, forged and tempered by the hand of history itself, destined to outlast the petty century I found myself in. It was on one of those drives, a bleak December morning near Heidelberg, that the final test presented itself. The road was a ribbon of black ice, the air sharp as shattered glass. My aide, Colonel Van Dorn, sat beside me, his face etched with the fatigue of humoring a deteriorating legend. I remember the rich smell of the gasoline, the steady hum of the engine, the ghostly convoy following far behind us in the mist. And then the voice, my own yet not my own, spoke from the core of my being. Prove it. Without a word, without a thought, I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The powerful car surged forward, a predator unleashed. Van Dorn shouted something, but his voice was drowned by the wind and the engine's roar. I laughed then, a short, sharp bark of defiance against mortality itself. The world dissolved into a tunnel of streaking pine and gray sky. A sharp bend approached, impossible at this speed. I did not slow. The tires screamed their protest, and time, as it does for the damned, folded. I was no longer in a car. I was on a horse, a great destrier charging through a hail of English arrows at Crécy. I was in a jeep, racing toward the sound of guns in Tunisia. I was in a chariot, urging it faster, faster toward the crumbling lines of a Persian army. I saw them all, the men I had led. The grim-faced Romans of the 3rd Augusta Legion, the mud-spattered Confederates of the Stonewall Brigade, the weary but determined GIs of the 4th Armored, all of them spectral, transparent, charging with me in a terrible, layered unison toward the same irrevocable cliff. My laugh became a warrior's roar, a challenge hurled at the face of God. Then, a shattering of the world into blinding light and absolute silence. When awareness returned, the world was twisted metal and the smell of spilled fuel. The Cadillac was wrapped around a tree. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks. Van Dorn, miraculously only shaken, touched my shoulder with a trembling hand. "General," he whispered, his voice thick with awe and horror, "you should be dead." And perhaps I was. For when I looked into the rearview mirror dangling from its bracket, the face that stared back was not wholly mine. It was a composite, the stern jaw of a Roman consul, the cold eyes of a medieval lord, the grimace of a Confederate cavalry officer, all layered beneath my own familiar features. The eyes that held mine burned not with life, but with the accumulated memory of 1,000 battles. They moved me to a requisitioned manor house outside Heidelberg, a place chosen for its isolation and its quiet, which to me was a torment. Doctors came with their reflex hammers and prognoses. Chaplains came with empty platitudes. Fellow generals came with pity poorly disguised. They said the crash had nearly severed my spinal cord. They said I was the luckiest man alive. I smiled at that. Luck is the crutch of the faithless. I knew the truth. I had felt the hand of destiny catch me at the brink of annihilation, and I could still feel its grip upon my spine, holding me in the world for purposes not yet fulfilled. The house was old, a drafty German Schloss filled with shadows and cruelly with mirrors. I avoided them at first, but soon I began to seek them out. In the dim glass I saw not one reflection but many. A pale, hawk-faced Norman knight over my left shoulder, a sun-leathered crusader behind me, a Union cavalry officer with fierce mustaches standing to my right. All bore the same intense, burning gaze. All bore a faint, familiar scar above the right brow, the mark I earned in the Great War. They were me, an army of past selves, awaiting orders from their current commander. Sleep abandoned me. In the thick silence, the ticking of the grand hall clock became the cadence of a distant march. Each tock was a boot falling on hard ground. Dogs barked in the village below, and their barking was the same anxious chorus that had preceded every battle from ancient Gaul to the Bulge. And when the morphine from the doctors thinned and my mind hovered in that raw place between pain and dream, the bronze soldier returned. Not at the foot of the bed, but closer, sitting in the armchair by the dead fireplace, watching me with infinite patience. I tried to pray one night to find some solace in the faith I professed, but the words of the Bible felt thin, foreign. My true liturgy was written in operations orders. My scripture was the map. My altar was the hood of a tank. Without a war to fight, I was a soul without a body. I began to speak aloud to the phantoms. What is the purpose? I demanded of the darkness. What is the end of this cycle? Am I to march forever from one body to the next, from one war to another, until the sun burns out? The darkness did not answer with words. It answered with a vision. I was suddenly standing not in a German bedroom, but in a vast, endless desert under a white-hot sun. Not the Sahara of Rommel, but a desert older than names. And before me, stretching to every horizon, was an army, but not of living men. They were echoes, specters in the uniforms of every age. Hoplites, musketeers, riflemen, tankers. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow sockets of light. They did not cheer. They did not salute. They simply stood, rank upon countless rank, waiting. And behind them I saw myself. Thousands of me. In a Macedonian kilt holding a sarissa. In Gothic plate armor. In the blue wool of the Union, the gray of the Confederacy, the olive drab of the AEF and the Third Army. An infinity of Pattons, each holding the banner of a fallen empire. The realization did not dawn, it froze me where I stood. Immortality was not life everlasting, it was identity everlasting. I was not a man living many lives. I was a single, relentless idea, the spirit of the offensive, the god of war's favorite disciple, trapped in the machinery of conquest, doomed to reenact the same brutal drama forever. Each life was not a life, but a campaign. Each death was merely a redeployment. There was no Valhalla for generals. Only an endless series of staff maps and dying young men. When I gasped back into the pain of my broken body in the German manner, the room had changed. It smelled of wet canvas, of mud, of fierce sweat, the sharp, clean odor of the front lines. A whisper slid from the corner where the bronze soldier sat. You cannot die, but you can forget. Would you like to forget? I reached for the pistol on my nightstand. My hand, which had never trembled ordering an attack, shook like a leaf. The bronze soldier stood and walked to the bedside. He knelt. In the faint moonlight I saw the detail on his armor, and there, carved into the pectoral, was not an imperial eagle, but the crest of the United States Third Army. He slowly raised his head, and the shadow beneath his helmet brow lifted. He had my face, but it was my face as it might be after 1,000 years of endless war. Eroded, timeless, utterly empty of everything but a faint, residual will. You are not immortal, General, he said, and his voice was the grind of tectonic plates. You are unfinished. The word was a direct hit. It shattered the last bastion of my delusion. The figure dissolved into motes of dust caught in a moonbeam, leaving a silence more terrible than any bombardment. And in that silence, the unbearable truth took hold. Perhaps death had already taken me long ago, in some forgotten field, and what remained was not George Patton, but the echoing, stubborn idea of him, a phantom refusing to believe the battle was over. Dawn came not with light, but with a slow leaching of gray into the black. I rose from the bed, my body a ruined temple, my mind the last contested ground. For the first time, I felt something colder than fear. The certainty that the war had never ended because I had never permitted it to end. I was the conflict that would not die. The doctor found me at the window, watching the fog swallow the world. He spoke of recovery, of patience, of returning to America a hero. I said nothing. What use was a hero in a world at peace? Later, alone, I did something perverse. I dressed in my full uniform, the one I'd worn in Berlin. I pinned every medal, every ribbon with a funereal slowness. Each piece of metal was a memory, a ghost pinned to my chest. When I looked in the hall mirror, I did not see a man. I saw a monument. Impressive, detailed, and hollow. Then the wind rose, and with it came a sound I knew in my marrow, the sound of marching. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of boots hitting the earth in perfect, world-shaking unison. The very walls of the Schloss trembled. I walked out into the grand corridor. They filled it, phantoms of every army I had ever commanded, standing in perfect, silent ranks that stretched into the impossible distance. Their eyes glowed with a soft, phosphorescent light, not of menace, but of unwavering expectation. They awaited my order as they always had across the centuries. "Stand down," I whispered, the words raw in my throat. They did not move. I walked among them. My bootsteps echoed, merging with the memory of theirs. As I passed, their forms flickered and changed. A GI's helmet melted into a crusader's great helm. A Roman's segmented armor appeared over a field jacket. All of them, every last one, turned their glowing eyes to me. I had been their voice, their will, their eternal, demanding God. And now I understood the price of their devotion. They could not rest because their God. I could not lay down my sword. At the far end of the spectral corridor, a final figure waited. Not the bronze soldier. This one was older, simpler. He wore a rough tunic of animal hide. He carried a spear of flint and wood. His face was my face, but stripped of all pretense, all civilization, reduced to its most essential elements: alertness, aggression, a terrible hunger. He was the first of us, the primal hunter who became the first warrior, the origin of the curse. "You have led long enough," he said. His voice was the first crack of lightning in a primeval sky. "Every victory is a chain, every conquest a brick in your own prison wall. You believed yourself immortal, and so you became the architect of your own cage." I opened my mouth to protest, to speak of duty, honor, country, God, but the words turned to ash. He was right. In the end, I had not served God or nation. I had served the fever in the blood, the raw, addictive hunger that lives in the heart of conquest, that devours the victor long after the battle is won. The first hunter extended a calloused hand. "End the march." I hesitated. To end it meant surrender. The one tactic I had never contemplated, never allowed. My entire being revolted. Yet as I hesitated, the world around us dissolved. The manor walls blew away like smoke. We stood not in a corridor, but on a vast, endless plain under a bruised twilight sky. It was a single, panoramic battlefield from all of time. Chariots lay splintered next to burning Shermans. Greek hoplites lay dead beside Normandy paratroopers. The banners of 100 empires, Roman eagles, Nazi swastikas, Crusader crosses, Confederate stars and bars, fluttered tattered in a sulphurous wind. It was the sum total of human conflict, and I saw with devastating clarity that I was not immortal. I was simply remembered. I existed because the world kept producing men like me and wars for us to fight. My curse was not an eternity of flesh, but an eternity of influence. I was the pattern, and the pattern would repeat as long as men drew lines on maps and called the other side enemy. The realization broke the last thing in me that could be broken. A sound escaped my lips, part sob, part laugh of utter defeat. And as it did, the spectral armies around me began to fade. The hoplite dissolved into mist. The legionary became a shimmer of light. The GI tipped his hat and vanished. The first hunter lowered his hand. The wind caught his final words and carried them to me, gentle as a benediction. "Then rest, General. Let history command itself." He was gone. The sound of marching ceased, not with a finale but with a fade like the last echo in a great canyon. The fog outside the window thinned, revealing a pale, fragile new dawn. For the first time in what felt like millennia, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The crushing burden of immortality, the need for it, was gone. In its place was a quiet, aching, terrifying freedom. I turned back to the window. Snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate, silent. It covered the scars of the German countryside, softening the edges of ruin. For a moment, even the ghosts obeyed its hush. It fell over the hills of Heidelberg like a pardon, burying the tank tracks, filling the shell holes, draping a pure shroud over the graves. I watched it gather on my windowsill, each flake a perfect, brief silence. The world was cleansing itself, while I remained, the final, stubborn stain of an old violence. I moved through the quiet manor, past the room where my uniform hung, a skin I had shed, past the maps, now just paper. My medals in their case glimmered dully in the weak light, tiny suns going cold. I felt no pride, only a profound irrelevance. There is a mercy in that. A man who no longer believes himself central to destiny can finally hear the chorus he drowned out with drumbeats, the nervous laughter of boys before battle, the prayers of mothers in 1,000 languages. The choked cries of the dying, which I had dismissed as the necessary cost of glory. They rose around me now in a single, mournful song. They were not accusing me. They were releasing me, and in that forgiveness I found a pain sharper than any shell fragment. Outside, a convoy rumbled down the distant road. New trucks, young men in clean uniforms, their faces alight with the eager, sacred fire I knew so well. The belief that they were chosen, that their cause was righteous, that they would be the victors history remembered. The wheel turning again, patient and pitiless. I wanted to run out to stop them, to shout that courage is not armor against regret, that victory is an empty room, that the only true peace is the peace you make with your own ghost. But my voice failed. My war was over. The age of my echo was ending. I walked to the empty stables where my jeep sat under a blanket of frost. I laid my gloved hand on its cold hood. This machine, my modern chariot, my steed of steel and gasoline, was still. I understood now that to rest was not to be defeated. It was, finally, to be free. The snow fell thicker until the world was a blur of white. In that whiteness I saw him one last time, the bronze soldier standing at the tree line where the forest began. He did not approach. He simply raised his arm in a final salute, a gesture not of subordination nor of command but of mutual recognition, one warrior to another at the long journey's end. Then he turned and walked into the blizzard. He left no footprints. I returned to my room and sat by the window. I took up this pen. These words, this final confession, would be my last campaign, not of conquest but of surrender. If anyone reads them, let them understand. The true immortality of a soldier lies not in a body that cheats death, but in the memory that refuses to die. And memory, when worshipped, becomes a ghost that haunts the living long after the guns fall silent. As the last candle guttered and died, I heard it one final time. A drum, distant, steady, relentless, beating from beyond the hills, beyond the snow, beyond time itself. It was the march of all wars yet to come. I smiled then, not with pride, but with a weary, final acceptance. History would march on without me. The flame would find new hands to carry it, new voices to shout forward, new believers in their own invincibility. The flame flickered and went out. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the past, whispering of a silence that might, for a little while, be mistaken for peace. And in that stillness, that deep and endless white, the general finally at last rested. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed and you are a true history lover, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to encourage me for making such content. Don't forget to press that bell icon so you will never miss any video about historical wars and battles. See you in the next video.